Okay, there it is, right? Okay, we're going to open this special meeting. Call for at 1:30. And now we will go on to 1.2. If there's any public comments, anybody wish to make any comments on this part of the agenda? Seeing those, we'll move on. And 2.1, the budget and resource allocation model.
Good afternoon. I'm going to do that so you can hear me. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this with you today. Before we get into the meat of what we're going to discuss today, I do want to address something regarding the coronavirus. We're not going to be discussing that today. It's not agendized, but it is going to impact our budget because we are buying a lot of supplies and doing other things that do have budget implications. Those implications are not shown in these numbers today because we're right in the thick of it. So I just want to let you know that, but that is something that is coming, and we just can't know right now what the extent of that will be. So first, we're going to talk about the budget, and this is super uncomfortable. Okay, I think that's better. Okay. So we're going to start with the budget discussion. And by the way, we do have our consultant, Ms. Kathy Blackwood. She's from Cambridge West Consulting, and she's been helping us in the development of the new resource allocation model. As we discuss the resource allocation model, it's important to note that we have not finished the model. What we have up here is a working draft that we're still talking about at the District Fiscal, I don't know what DFAC stands for anymore, District Fiscal Advisory Council. And so, while much of it is, there may be consensus at the table, the format of this group is that we have representatives from all constituency groups at the table, and then they take this back to their various groups and present the model, and we get input from the groups, and then they come back to the table, and we make adjustments based on input. So it's a very much iterative process. So what we're showing you today is sort of where we are as of this moment, but we did want to involve you so that you know what's going on. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about the budget and where we are. So first, we have the apportionment cycle, and I know we throw around a lot of terms like advance apportionment, first principal apportionment, second apportionment, and recalculations. These are the 4 times in the year that we get numbers from the state. And so what it used to be is you'd get a number at advance, it true up a little at first principal apportionment, particularly it might true up a lot if your FTS went down, but it true up a little at first, a little bit more at second, and then you might get a little bit at recalc. So in the days of the student-centered funding formula, this cycle has taken on a lot greater meaning. So what's happening now is that the apportionment cycle is being used more for the state to add money on as the risk gets less throughout the year. So the farther we are into the fiscal year, the less the state's risk is because they know more about how much money is coming in from property taxes, and so they feel more comfortable handing out more money. But that's very different than what they did in the old days, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is our state apportionment for 2018-19. And what we can see from this page is that it's volatile. So at the beginning of 18-19, we had an advance at 104.4 million. It went down to 99.2 million. There was a huge outcry throughout the state. The deficit, I think, was over 500 million at that time, the projected deficit. Then at P2, which was mere weeks later, because they were late. That's the other thing I need to tell you about the apportionment cycle. It has dates, but they're not always true. So I think they were late with the first principal apportionment cycle, but they've been later. So I think we should just say thank you. And they were, recalc was a day late, something like that. They did well this year, but they had a lot of pressure to get this out. So mere weeks later, we were up to 102.8. And then at recalc, we came in at 105.5. So there's a lot of volatility last year. And, that's a real concern because I found out on February, I think it was 20th, 21st, 22nd, somewhere in there, how much money we got in 2018-19. That is way too late to do any good for the 2018-19 year. The books are closed, it's over. So, now what the state used to do was they would start with where they thought districts were going to be. And then as the year went by, if they started to be concerned about a deficit, they would deficit at the end, not at the beginning or toward the end. So there were downsides to that in that districts would all of a sudden find out they weren't getting the money they thought they were getting. But on the other hand, applying significant deficits at the start of the year and then getting $3 million or $2.8 million, 8 months after the fact, it's not doing our district any good in terms of offering instruction in the fiscal year in which the money was earned. So then for this year, our advance was 103.4, and if you recall, that was the advanced TCR, and that was based on our constrained TCR, and that had nothing to do with anything to do with the student-centered funding formula. That just happened to be a number that the Chancellor's Office had developed for 2018-19, and so they moved that forward to the advance. And then as of P1, we now have a number of 106.3 million.
Excuse me. Excuse me. The 103 is, if we go back to the very first one, advance, is that part of that particular funding?
The advance,
Yes.
so for this year,
104.5?
104.3 was at the advance. 103.4, thank you. And that was at the advance this year. And now we're at first principal apportionment,
Okay.
which is 106.3, okay? So first, let's talk about 2018-19 and what that means. Our 2018-19 TCR, total computational revenue, ended up being $105.6 million. Our recalculation in February was 105.4, so we got 99.9% of our money versus the second principal apportionment payment, which was 102.7. So our increase, which is only one time, because remember, this is one-time money that we're getting after the fact for 18-19, is 2.8 million. And again, I just point out, this is a nice thing to get, but we can use that money, and we need that money, but it would have been even better to get it within the instructional year when we could use it for, the colleges, for offering instructions to our students. So now we're looking at 2019. So the calculation for our total computational revenue is 110.4 million, which is roughly what we calculated when we did the final budget. Our mistake was in the final budget that we only deficited to approximately 108 million. The state deficited us to 103.4, which is a deficit of approximately 6.3%. That's a huge deficit and is consistent with the deficits. I think it's even more than the deficits we were seeing during the economic downturn. So now the state says during P, first principal apportionment, no, we're actually going to give you 106.3. And so if you look on the right side, so now we're getting 96.3% of our TCR, and that's still a 3.7% deficit. That is still a very healthy deficit number. So they're still applying deficits the same really as they did last year. We did have a discussion in, well, let me go through the chart and then we'll talk about it. So then we have in our final budget, in our final budget, to balance, what we had done was we had decreased expenditures, and we had also assumed that we would bring in $718,000 from the pension rate stabilization plan. And we had said that if we get enough money at P1 to offset that, we wouldn't do that. So when you look at 2.9 million, we have enough to cover that 718, and so that leaves us with 2.2 million roughly. Then we had budget augmentations, and that included Modesto JC budget augmentation at 3.6 million, and then IT at 250,000. And so our deficit spending in the budget was 3.8 or 3.9 million. So the remaining deficit spending is 1.7. Now, in terms of the IT 250, we probably don't have to worry about that because we did have fund balance that was specifically identified for IT of 500,000, and we used half of that. But again, that will be a board decision to make. So we have in our budget roughly a $1.7 million hole in our budget. It's a structural deficit that we have to figure out. And even if you take out the IT, we're at about 1.5 million deficit. So that means that we have to figure out what to do next year as we move forward. We do have the money from 18-19, if you remember on this slide. We have the money to help us out with that. And we do have a plan with the resource allocation model that we may use some of the fund balance for its intended purposes. If you recall, we have fund balance that is attributable to STRS and PERS funding, so that we can realign some of our realign resources so that MJC has more resources, while at the same time we're not taking away resources from Central Services or Columbia Colleges, because we want Columbia College to be able to operate, and we want MJC to be able to operate. But on the other hand, MJC needs to have more dollars associated with it. So we can use some of this money to offset the ongoing deficit in the future. And so we'll talk more about that when we discuss the RAM. Okay. So the big question becomes, and we struggled with it last year, what do we assume for the revenue for 2020-21? And we've really looked at this a lot of different ways. And one of the ways we thought to do it was to take the P1 ongoing revenue, because we know that's in our base of 106.2, plus the COLA of 2.29%, which we have to earn, but you know, we think we can do that. I considered, and it had been suggested to me, and I'd thought of it myself, of going back and using money that we know we have, this 2.768, and adding that. So the problem with that, and as I turned it over and tried to think about it, is that it violates a basic budget principle. you're using one-time money for ongoing expenditures. So we may still do that, but in a different way where it's a planned expenditure, stepping down from year to year to where we're not doing that to a balanced budget. But for right now, we decided not to do that. And then we added a deficit factor because, you know, how can we not? Because I know we're not going to get the 110. I know that. But I'm not entirely sure that we're going to get, you know, earn the COLA. And I don't know what the state's going to come up with next. So they continue to change the formula. We suggested that they stand down for a year, perhaps, and let us just have this formula. And they want to change it for first gen and one other factor that I can't quite recall. So we can't ever get stabilized. We can't ever get to a point where we can predict with any accuracy. So next is our FTES. Our FTES grew this year over last year, or is projected to grow. However, this does not account for any changes to the summer schedule that may occur due to the virus. I don't know that they will occur, but for instance, if we were to go all online, there may be impact from that. So for right now, we're projecting that our FTS will grow, and that is mostly due to, that is all due actually to MJC. They have been able to increase FTS in a very difficult market. Most schools are hanging on as best they can and actually reducing FTES. So MJC's done a very good job with actually increasing FTES. So we're very grateful for that. So that's our FTES. So what we're looking at now is we've also had a request from MJC that, if you recall, last year we had a one-time request for $3.6 million, which the board did approve. And we have had a request this year for $4 million at a minimum. There are other numbers. And so just so you know that we have a $4 million request. We also have, though, a resource allocation model that would allocate the funds that would not necessarily recognize that request. It would simply, you know, work the way the model would work. So with that, I'm going to ask our consultant, Ms. Kathy Blackwood, to from Cambridge West Consulting, to talk about the resource allocation model for us. Okay? Unless, are there any questions on the budget? True. Well, I think they're asking for things that are actually included in this model, but perhaps not in our old model. I'm not entirely sure because we are working on a resource allocation model. So I wasn't entirely sure. I think it's probably because we have two models. We have an existing model right now, and then we have this model, which is, I would say, it's at the point where it's going out to groups and it's being discussed. From my perspective, we can't use the existing model in its current form. We have to do a lot of adjusting because we've made adjustments. And so from my perspective, I would like to use this model as a pilot until we get, and as we get more info back from the groups, we'll continue to make changes. But I'd like to use it as a pilot. For instance, the model does include things that MJC is asking for, such as augmentations for step and column and augmentations for, things that they have to pay for. Whereas before, we did augment for step and column this year, but prior we didn't. And I don't know why, because the colleges have to pay for that. So, so I would prefer to use this as a pilot until we can get, a final approval or recommendation for the model. So I'll just put that out there, and I think we should just discuss the model. And I think it gets MJC more money, and that's my preference. But I think we should talk about the model first.
Good afternoon. As Dr. Yeager said, I'm Kathy Blackwood. I work for Cambridge West Consulting, but you might know me more familiarly. I'm the retired Executive Vice Chancellor from San Mateo County Community College District. I was there 15 years and 15 years at Foothill De Anza Community College District. So I have lots of experience with multi-college districts. So when I was approached to work on a resource allocation model for Yosemite, I felt like I had done this several times and had some background to help with it. So that's who I am. So I'm going to go through a few things with you. Feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Some of this is pretty complex, but we wanted to give you as much information as possible. So if we get into the weeds a little bit, feel free to interrupt and say, I don't get it, or please explain that some more, and I'd be happy to. Okay, so the first question is, what is the current model? Well, originally, and we're going back a few years, there was a fixed percentage that went to central services, and then the colleges, the remaining funding was given to the colleges and split 85-15, so 85% to MJC and 15% to Columbia. But with the consolidation of services like public safety coming to central services, and with compensation increases, the percentages no longer apply. They're no longer valid. So that was part of it, is how can we do something why, the current model doesn't seem to be working. Right now, we've been bringing in, as new funds come in, they've been split 85-15, but that really hasn't addressed the college's needs. So the new model, one, it needs to be more transparent. It needs to be really fairly basic about where the money's coming from, where it's going to, and why. It needs to address and respond to the new state funding model. So the state funding model now is based a good chunk on outcomes, and so we wanted to reflect that in the district's model. And we want a model that addresses the needs of both our students and our colleges. So, as was noted, DFAC, the District Fiscal Advisory Committee, has representatives from each of the colleges, from each of the unions, from each of the senates, and while students were invited, they have not appointed anybody, so we're going to have to reach out to the students to make sure that they're aware of what we're trying to do here. This group has been an incredible group to work with. I will say that they've worked really hard. We are meeting twice a month. We've been meeting twice a month since fall. They've been very good about taking the information back to their constituent groups and bringing back feedback, and we've made changes because of that. In addition, I actually did a presentation here at Columbia to the Academic Senate on the model. So we're really trying to get everybody involved and make sure that everyone's had a chance to see it and comment and give us, in some cases, some very useful suggestions. So that's been great. Now, the first thing we did, and I'll point you out to the single-page handout that you have, is we came up with a values statement. And I started out by taking the list of values that the group that created our last statewide funding model, SB 361, had developed, and ran it past the committee. And the committee said, well, this is important to us. Well, you don't have this in. We want this in. So the list you have in front of you, which includes characteristics, behaviors, and data issues, are what our group came up with as being important values that our model should cover. And I'm not going to read every one of them. You can read it, but you can see that there's some certain things that we really wanted to emphasize: students first, prudent and good use of your money, making it timely so that people can be involved, and using data that everybody can understand and see, very quantitative, very verifiable for the outcomes. And then the very last one, which I think is incredibly important, is that this is going to be a living model. It isn't done once and you're over and you never change it again. It should be changed as we go through the changing scenarios that happen both within the district and within the state. And so DFAC would be the group that would review the model on a regular basis and make sure that it still meets the needs of the district. Okay, so here's the new model. It is using the student-centered funding formula, and that's the formula that replaced SB 361, which the old model was based on. And this model actually takes the student-centered funding formula, takes our college's data, plugs it in, and comes up with a ratio between the two colleges based on their actual funding that they're receiving through the state. Now, I will say that this is not a perfect match. Part of it is that we cannot tie individual college data to what the state reports as district data, and the state does not disaggregate it by college. And so if we have students that attend two of our colleges, both of them, and therefore get counted in each college's data, the state counts the student once. That's part of it. You know, if a student gets a certificate here and then later goes and gets a degree over there, then only the degree is counted and the certificate isn't. But this college over here doesn't know that that degree wipes out their certificate. So we've got some of those kinds of things. The state has promised us they will give us college-level data, but has not yet done that. So we're using it as a proxy. It's not exact. We know it's not exact, but it's close. And we're using a 3-year average so that we're not picking any one year that might have some anomaly in it, but rather can show trends. It means if a college is growing, their funding's going to grow a little more slowly, their share. On the other hand, if they're declining, their decline will also be a little slower, and it sort of smooths things out a little. So that's the intent. So one of the steps, and I'll go through each of the steps actually in the model, but one of the steps says, well, look at the two colleges. Are they split in the right percentage? And the answer right now, if you're looking at the student-centered funding formula, is no. MJC is indeed underfunded. There's no question about it. And so this model would say, I'm not taking money away from Columbia, because Columbia couldn't survive if you did, but I am allocating additional money to MJC. And that means the balance isn't quite right yet, because to really make it right, I'd have to take it away from Columbia. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to harm Columbia while benefiting MJC. But, yes.
If what you're describing, because obviously this caught my attention, representing this trustee area, but wouldn't the word be more allocating it equitably? Because the word additional sounds like they will get more than Columbia College.
They will. They will. Yes, we are allocating more money to MJC, as the board has done this year, and allocated them an additional, you know.
Well, of course they get more. I mean, of course they have a
Yeah.
larger budget. But the allocation is distributed based on the same principle, no?
Yes, based on the same principle, but based on the same principle, right now, if you look at the total computational revenue of 110 million, and you said, what would it be if you split it between the